Hello and welcome to my talk. In this session, we're going to be talking about car hacking and specifically what that means for the auto parts manufacturing industry. Before we get started, a little bit about me. My name is Hutch, and I'm the Assessment Services Practice Lead at a company called Set Solutions. I lead our threat and vulnerability management, our application security, and our incident response services. Throughout my career, I have focused on specializing in adversarial attack simulations to include penetration testing, offensive security, and red teaming, or more generally what's referred to as ethical hacking. I've also made a point throughout my career to focus on unique and highly nuanced areas of cybersecurity. I have significant experience hacking embedded devices and IoT systems to include medical devices, voice assistants, industrial control systems and SCADA devices, point of sales, and as we'll be discussing today, automotive vehicles. I've also spoken at multiple major information security conferences to include DEF CON, the world's largest annual hacking convention, where I've delivered talks at both the Red Team Village and the IoT Hacking Village. I'm also the creator and author of Sociospoilt, an information security blog that focuses on the intersection of technology, hacking, and social psychology. And you can find content related to all of my independent research there. You can also find me on Twitter at Sociospoilt. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called ReadySetSecure, where we cover information security news and other special topics of interest related to information security. And that can be found on all major podcast apps and services. And finally, and a bit more timely, for the month of October, my team at Set Solutions is hosting our second annual Capture the Flag event. So if you enjoy technical challenges and want an opportunity to win some cool prizes, it's free to play, and you can register at ctf.setsolutions.com. So now onto the fun stuff. First, let's talk about our roadmap. The first thing that we're going to be discussing is the history of car hacking and how car hacking has traditionally been approached. Next, we're going to talk about emerging attack surface and how the approaches to attacking or hacking a vehicle have started to change as vehicles have evolved. We're then going to talk about why it matters, and specifically why it matters to the auto parts manufacturing industry. And then finally, we're going to talk about what manufacturers can do in order to minimize their risk by implementing secure by design principles. So first, let's talk about the history of car hacking. Here you can see a very simple logical representation of the network topology of a vehicle. The two major components that we're going to be discussing at length are ECUs, or electronic control units, and that is represented by the blue boxes that you see on the diagram. These are essentially nodes on a network. They're different microcomputers and components that are communicating with each other within a vehicle's ecosystem. The other component is the CAN, or the controller area network, and this is essentially the network bus that all of these ECUs communicate with each other on, and they use various different signaling protocols in order to communicate with one another. Here, rather than the logical topology diagram that we just looked at, you can see more of the physical topology, so you can see really what it actually looks like inside a vehicle. And as you can see, we've just got a series of wires that run through the physical body of the vehicle. And these wires make up the CAN bus on which the different nodes or the different ECUs within the vehicle communicate with one another. Now, arguably, both the logical diagram that we looked at in the previous slide and this physical diagram are fairly oversimplified compared to modern cars. The topology of vehicles is getting more and more complex. Here you can see an example of a more modern multibus topology where we've actually got multiple different communications buses connected by a centralized gateway. For even newer or higher end vehicles, you can see that we've increased the complexity even more. Here we've got once again, a multi-bus network, but this time the centralized gateway manages a collection of different Ethernet networks and uses domain controllers in order to regulate the data that flows between each of those different CAN buses. So the result of this is somewhat of a mixed bag. Obviously, with each new iteration, we are seeing increased isolation within the network architecture, and that's a good thing. It also lends itself to increased security through obscurity. And what I mean by that, as the complexity of the architecture of these networks increases, it becomes more and more complicated. It becomes harder for an attacker or a hacker to attempt to approach and attempt to exploit. Uh, Unfortunately, this can also result in a false sense of protection because the reality is we should never rely exclusively on security through obscurity because there will always be somebody who is capable of stepping through the documentation and figuring out exactly what's going on and still being able to execute exploits within that environment. It also, because we have more complexity, means that there's greater chance for oversight because that complexity doesn't just apply to somebody who is attempting to hack the environment, but it also applies to those that are attempting to protect and to harden that environment. And the more complex that environment is, the easier it is for individuals who are implementing hardening controls to overlook something. And it also means more attack surface, more different areas that could fail that attackers could potentially target. So the way that hackers have traditionally interacted with a vehicle network is the same way that technicians interact with it, and that is using the standardized onboard diagnostics or the OBD2 port. So back in 1996, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, implemented a regulation that required all vehicles to have this standard OBD2 port available on all vehicles. This port allows for direct interaction with the CAN network, and it can generally be found underneath the steering column on any vehicle. Obviously, the intended purpose per the EPA was to focus on emissions data, but given the amount of metrics that is available and coming off of that CAN network at any time, it's also been commonly used by auto technicians for servicing and troubleshooting various issues on vehicles. Traditional interactions required plugging in to that OBD2 interface with a serial port adapter and then some kind of physical interface that allowed you to analyze diagnostics. Of course, that interface generally had significant limitations as far as the ways that you could interact with the CAN bus, as far as what data you could receive. A lot of them were just read only, and if they weren't, they had very limited functionality in terms of what else they could do on that network. More modern adapters provided wireless interface capability, so there are now adapters that you can plug into that OBD2 port, and it does enable Bluetooth communication. This allows you to interact with that OBD2 service and with the CAN network using something like a mobile device. However, similar to the hardware diagnostics tools that auto techs use, it's also somewhat limited as far as how you can interact with that CAN network. So from a hacking perspective, you still interact with this same functionality with that CAN bus by plugging into the OBD2 port, but you do it in a way that you have an interface that allows you full control over your interactions with that CAN network. And so the way that we do that is we still plug into that interface, but we have a USB port that returns back to a Linux-based computer that we have, and we can use various different utilities that allow significantly more control over the way that we interact with and interrogate the network compared to what you can do with traditional diagnostics tools. The information as far as the way that the OBD2 port supports communications is publicly available on the internet. You can find pinout documentation all over, and there are certain pins that we obviously want to focus on here. So we have the high CAN network, which is the number 6 pin. And the high CAN network is a high speed and redundant network that has multiple wires. And this is intended to support critical operations of the vehicle. So stuff like your engine, your transmission, fuel injection, brakes, etc. Then we have the 14 pin, which is the low CAN network. And this is a lower speed network and is just a single wire network. And it supports communication across the less critical communications ECUs of the vehicle system. These usually include stuff like windshield wipers, windows, locks, interior lights, It's also worth noting that there are multiple different pins that are reserved as vendor option. And these often provide some unique attack surface as well, because there's a greater potential for risk. These are proprietary buses, they're proprietary, sometimes even proprietary protocols that different auto manufacturers implement on these lines of communication. And because they're non-standardized, they don't receive the same level of scrutiny as standardized protocols that are used throughout the industry. This, once again, can result in oversights and vulnerabilities that are less likely to be identified. But it also means that there's greater obscurity. Obviously, there is less documentation available, and sometimes even the vendors don't make documentation as far as how these communicate or protocols are intended to communicate. So once you've plugged into the CAN network with your USB port and you're connecting back to a Linux system, there are a lot of well-known utilities that have been available for years for hacking CAN bus interactions. CAN utils is probably one of the most commonly known ones that supports multiple different interactions, from sniffing and analysis all the way up to injection of communications and fuzzing of CAN bus protocols. Personally, my weapon of choice is a tool called scapy. Now, scapy has a slightly steeper learning curve because it has higher complexity, but it also has far more flexibility and versatility as far as what you can do from a hacking perspective. It supports packet frames for CAN protocols at the data link layer. It supports the ISO-TP transport layer protocols, and also a wide variety of different application layer protocols to include industry and vendor-specific protocols. It is a extensible tool that was originally created for the focus on traditional networking communications. But over the years, because of its extensibility, has been supported by a large number of independent developers who have implemented more and more different and more obscure protocols. And so that's how we've seen the scapy framework expand to include the different communication protocols that are used within automotive environments. To be able to effectively use a tool like scapy, you really need to understand the packet frame structure for different communication protocols. Once again, these can be readily found publicly available on the internet. Here's an example of the CAN data frame, but you can also find similar documentation available for ISO-TP transport protocol implementations and most of those other application layer protocols that we had discussed. So one of the great things about scapy is that it provides a fully interactive terminal interface. Here you can see that we can load non-native or more obscure protocols using the load functions, and at the bottom you can see that we've loaded both the CAN and CAN socket functions and objects. So once those functions and objects are loaded, you can then instantiate these as objects and assign them to variables. You can then manipulate the object attributes of those variables in order to control what data is assigned to different fields in the packet frames. Here you can see that we've established a CAN socket connection to an interface channel that we have access to, namely CAN 0. We've created a CAN packet object, manipulated the identifier and data fields that are within that packet object, and then we've used the socket SR1 function, which is send and receive one packet, to inject the packet onto the bus. Now, what's really great about scapy is that it supports full integration with the Python scripting language. So this allows you to actually code out different interactions with the CAN bus, whether that is listening for certain communications and then based on information that it receives from the bus, then injecting variable information onto the bus. And by doing this, you can actually create full exploitation programs that are adaptive based on the environment that it's interacting with. Some of the core capabilities that scapy supports includes managing and filtering the CAN sockets that it's interacting with. It can actually load in packet capture or PCAP data and can parse that and deconstruct the packets based on the known data frames for the different protocols. It can do raw packet crafting and building packets from scratch. It can support packet injection by re-injecting those back onto the CAN networks. And then it can also allow packet manipulation so that you can receive packets off of the wire, change attributes within those packets, and then re-inject them back into the wire. This provides a few different research opportunities. So one of the most common ways of performing research as far as what can be done injecting into this CAN bus is by doing replay attacks. So you'll physically interact with components within the vehicle in order to trigger the CAN bus communications that are required in order to interact with some downstream component within the vehicle. And then once you're able to identify the network communications that take place, you can then just attempt to replay that traffic directly on the CAN bus without interacting with those physical components. And in doing so, you can often solicit different events to occur within the vehicle without actually interacting with the controls. You can also do kind of targeted content injection attacks where you manipulate the parameters of communications that are sent over the wire in order to attempt to change the outcomes of different communications and how the different components of the vehicle respond based on the projected result of those manipulations. And then finally, and definitely the most risky in terms of potentially damaging downstream components, is just outright fuzzing. And fuzzing is taking different components of that data stream and then just sending purely random data into them, and then looking for different anomalous behavior and measuring the behaviors of the outcomes of those random information injections in order to trigger events that you may not have otherwise foreseen as possible whenever interacting with the data communications. So now that we've talked about the history of vehicle hacking and how hackers have traditionally focused on vehicle exploitation, let's now talk about how things are changing, the emerging attack surface that both vehicle manufacturers and parts manufacturers are having to contend with on increasingly connected vehicles. Obviously, times are changing. Vehicles of today are not the same as vehicles of yesterday. We're now seeing increasing interaction between various different automotive parts within the ecosystem of a vehicle. And we're also seeing increasing interactions between those parts and the public internet. The traditional car hacks that we had discussed used to require direct interaction with a closed network, either physical access to that onboard diagnostics port, or at least close proximity in order to support Bluetooth interactions. But modern vehicles are no longer a closed network. We are now seeing multiple interconnected networks and multiple components with direct access to the internet. So because of this, vulnerabilities that exist in products can have consequences that extend far beyond just the failure or the compromise of that product itself. Many of these products are dual homed and may have access to the public internet and possibly access to either networks within the vehicle or to other components within the vehicle that do have access to those networks. As such, the compromise of these products can operate as a pivot point for attackers, allowing them to move through the ecosystem of different interconnected networks in a vehicle, and can turn a seemingly inconsequential compromise of a product in the vehicle to ultimately a full compromise of the vehicle operations itself. This was demonstrated to its fullest extent at Black Hat in 2015, when security researchers Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek demonstrated that they could remotely access the CAN bus of a Jeep through a series of exploits that started with them attacking the infotainment system, which had access to the public internet. This infotainment system was then allowed them to pivot to a microcontroller, and this microcontroller had read access to the CAN bus. And what they were able to do is exploit a vulnerability on that microcontroller in order to reprogram it to allow it to support packet injection onto the CAN. And once they were able to do that, they were then able to use this series of exploits to fully control the vehicle and even the most core operations of that vehicle, to include transmission, steering, and brakes. A fascinating video was a short interaction, a demonstration that was coordinated between these researchers and Wired magazine, in which the journalist agreed to get on the highway with a compromised vehicle and zero knowledge of what the security researchers were going to do with the vehicle. So let's quickly look at that 1-minute video.
But as I drove down the interstate, things started getting unpleasant and very loud. Perfect. I can't turn it down.
This was such a fun video. Steve, okay, get out to
Now the air conditioning is blasting, the music is blasting, and I can't see anything because of the windshield wiper fluid.
Okay, do it. Do it. Kill the engine.
So we're killing the engine right now.
It says park sense. Actually can't accelerate. I stomped on the gas, but the Jeep slowed to a crawl. It says 43 miles an hour, but I'm not going that fast. I turned on my hazard lights, but I was still stuck in the right lane with no shoulder to escape onto. Guys, I'm stuck on the highway.
What are you saying?
Oh, I think he's panicking. He's not gonna be able to hear us with that radio. It's so loud.
Guys, I need the accelerator to work again.
So obviously, after seeing that video, you're hopefully thinking that the possibility of these type of remote exploits on vehicles is absolutely terrifying. And that's exactly what you should be thinking. But the question that then follows is, this research was published back in 2015, so why haven't we seen more of this? And I think there's a couple reasons for that. The first is those that would publish are not doing the research. Obviously, for your ordinary security researcher, many of them don't have the budget to spend over $30,000 on a side project where they can do dedicated security research on a vehicle. And because of that, researchers and enthusiasts who are doing car hacking on the side are likely doing so with the vehicle that they transport their family around in, or the vehicle that they use to get to and from work. And when that's the case, you have to be especially careful of the type of research that you're performing, and likely have to curtail some of the research activities that you would otherwise perform out of just sheer regard for safety of the people that are moving around in that vehicle. And then on the other side of that coin, the people that are doing the research likely aren't publishing, and that is organizations like nation states and organized crime syndicates who might have interest in getting vehicle exploits. And then hopefully manufacturers are attempting to get ahead of some of these vulnerabilities by doing internal research themselves and closing those vulnerabilities before they get out to the public. So why would nation states or organized crime syndicates want to compromise a vehicle? Well, there's the more benign answer of getting access to data. Obviously, you have components that are interacting directly with your cellular devices, and by compromising a vehicle's network, you may be able to get access to user data. And then there's obviously the more extreme possibility of this is a excellent opportunity to perform assassination attempts where, rather than looking like an assassination, it looks more like it was an automotive accident. Now, there's also been some interesting talk in the industry about the possibility of new ransomware variants. Unlike the traditional infrastructure that we see, there could be the possibility of somebody that takes over somebody's vehicle, and then we've taken over your $100,000 smart vehicle, now pay us this $10,000 ransom, and we'll allow you access back to it. So we haven't seen much of that, actually, or any of that in the wild yet, but it's certainly a possibility that could occur. Now, of course, I'm probably sounding like the guy with the tinfoil hat and the conspiracy theorist in talking about the possibility of using vehicles for assassination attempts or for gaining access to people's data. But the truth is, it's not as far-fetched as you would think it would be. Back in 2017, there was a disclosure on WikiLeaks of the Vault 7 exploits, which were CIA hacking tools that were exploited and then released to the public. And in this documentation that was made available in WikiLeaks, it showed that there was ongoing research being performed by the CIA of remote attacks and exploits to be performed on vehicles. So now that we understand the emerging attack surface and how vehicles and products within vehicles could potentially be used in attacks that would allow attackers to completely take over and compromise automotive vehicles, let's now talk about why this matters for the automotive parts industry. Vehicle hacking is no longer just a concern for vehicle manufacturers. Theoretically, any component, whether native or aftermarket, that is connected to other components in the vehicle or that is connected to the vehicle bus or any kind of networked component could potentially be used as a pivot point within a larger attack chain that could result in total vehicle compromise. Aftermarket products could potentially be used as that pivot point in order to allow an attacker to get access to critical CAN bus operations. One of the most important things to note about these exploit scenarios that we're talking about is that they involve multiple steps. They involve pivoting through an ecosystem of interconnected devices. And as such, any weak link in that ecosystem could potentially be used to advance an attacker's objectives. And ultimately, compromises in such devices could result in significant financial loss. Best case scenario, it could result in impact to the customer's data or privacy violations. Obviously, worst case scenario, as in the cases that we're talking about, could result in potential loss of life. Either way, these could translate for the business into significant financial loss in the forms of lawsuits, regulatory fines, or product recalls. For example, in the situation back in 2015 that we discussed, Chrysler ended up having to recall 1.4 million different Jeeps in order to address the remote hacking concerns that we previously discussed. Ultimately, if a product is used as an entry vector or a pivot point, the fallout could be very costly. And so now that we understand why it matters to do something about this, let's discuss what can be done by parts manufacturers in order to minimize their risk. Vehicle security is ultimately a partnership between vehicle manufacturers and product suppliers. For product suppliers who are ultimately contributing just a very small component in a much larger ecosystem of communications, it may be impossible for them to fully stop a vehicle compromise. However, what suppliers can do is they can minimize the likelihood that their particular product is used as a pivot point within that attack kill chain that would ultimately allow an attacker to move from otherwise benign components of the vehicle's operations to the core operations of the vehicle. And in order to achieve this, suppliers and manufacturers need to be implementing secure by design principles throughout the development lifecycle of any given product. And what this means is consistently considering security every step of the way. So this can be done by, at routine intervals, performing threat modeling, which consists of discussion-based exercises in order to evaluate the risks of different design considerations. This involves considering the potential threats and the exposures that may exist based on the way that the product is being designed, and then cross-referencing those against controls that are being implemented in order to minimize the likelihood that those exposures will be exploited, and then ultimately identifying potential gaps that may exist. Additionally, security testing can be performed and should be performed both internally within the organization throughout the life cycle of development, but also should be performed by independent vendors in order to get an independent third-party perspective. This allows you to make sure that your team isn't overlooking things, but it also becomes a good control for your business to minimize the likelihood of risk that if something does happen, you are considered to be negligent because you did try to acquire the perspective of a qualified independent third-party assessor. And then finally, you also need to implement a VDP or a vulnerability disclosure program. And this is ultimately just a channel that allows the public to communicate any potential vulnerabilities that they identify back to you through defined and standardized means. This could be as simple as just a website that says, if you find any flaws within our product, report back to us using this email or through this particular secure form communication. Some other tactical things that you likely want to consider while doing product design is obviously avoid clear text or hard-coded credentials. Using industry-leading cryptography, both to authenticate different components to one another, but also to ensure that communications between different components are confidential and cannot be eavesdropped upon. Implement mechanisms to support patching and updating of products. If you do end up in a situation where there's a discovery that there's a vulnerability in one of your products, it will be significantly less costly if you can remotely push out a patch to that product rather than having to fully recall the entire line of products. Also keep in mind that by implementing this kind of functionality, you are implementing additional attack surface, and security for that update functionality also needs to be considered as well. Also, minimize attack surface through isolation and least privilege. If something doesn't need to be able to communicate with other components, then it shouldn't be able to. Implement software integrity checks where you're performing evaluations to make sure that software within your components are not modified before execution. Implement controls to provide resiliency and fault tolerance to make sure that your product is less likely to fail, and if it does fail, that it's failing in a way that's either safe and secure, or if those two things are mutually exclusive, that it is at least failing safe. So now that we've discussed what we can do in order to minimize the risk to product manufacturers, let's quickly go over what we've discussed today. Obviously, hackers are going to hack, and nothing stays hidden forever. Vulnerabilities do exist, and we are increasingly going to see these emerging vulnerabilities being exploited within product lines of vehicles. Secure product design is a best practice that should be implemented regardless, but these emerging trends of different types of attacks is just one more reason of why we should be doing what we should have been doing already, which is secure by design implementation. And ultimately, don't get caught with your pants down. This is just the beginning. There will be more attacks that are going to become more and more common. Like I said, nothing stays hidden forever, and these will come to light. So be proactive as an organization and make sure that while, again, as a products manufacturer, you may not be able to stop a vehicle compromise altogether, make sure that your part is not contributing to the attack sequence and that you are not the weakest link that allows the remote compromise of a vehicle. You obviously don't want to be the front page headline that everybody else thinks back to as to why they are going to rethink the way that they're doing security. And that's it for today. So I appreciate everybody that joined this talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you to AASA for having us out.